I'm Janet Booth, a professional astrologer from West Hartford, Connecticut, and welcome to my program on astrology called Looking Up. This episode is entitled Spring is in the Air. I'm recording it in February, almost near the midway point through the winter, and it sure is a nice thought to think about how spring is in the air. And as we go on, I will tell you a little bit why I wanted to put the air word into the title of this show. So, an ancient technique for forecasting, particularly on what we call mundane or worldly matters, is to look at what's called an ingress chart. Ingress means going into. And when we have the sun going into the sign of Aries, that is the start of spring. And for the northern hemisphere at least, and from ancient, Greek culture and maybe others, this was considered the first sign of the zodiac and really the beginning of the zodiacal year. So a chart would be constructed for that moment when spring began, and they would look at where the planets were in relation to each other, what signs, what connections they're making. And for a specific location, you can even look at it as to where around the circle, and that relates to the four directions, where the planets are placed. So I'm going to have a chart brought up for you now, and it might look a lot like Greek to you because actually all the symbols do come from Greek or from the Greek astrologers. And this is the chart of the spring equinox, and it is placed in Washington, D.C. Now, you don't have to place it in any place. You could just start by putting 0 Aries on the middle of the left-hand side, which is where 9 o'clock would be on a clock face. And nowadays it's hard to say that because we have digital clocks so much. But anyway, the middle of the left-hand side. And we would put 0 Aries there, and each of the 12 sectors going around the circle would be one of the signs. So that would be sort of like the world horoscope. And this is a moment in time that is experienced around the world, and you would just find that in different sectors of the world, there'll be different prominences. And I'm going to speak a little bit about this, especially in relation to weather. So when you look at this chart, even if you don't know any astrology, you can see how everything is clustered in 1/3 of the chart, except for one little guy that's up in the upper left corner, looks like an asterisk over a cross. That's not one of the regular planets, so forget about that for just a second. So when we have everything clustered within 1/3 of the chart, it's called a bundle distribution pattern. And it kind of means that we bundle our energy up, or we're very concerned about certain things and hardly concerned about other things. And in this case, what we're seeing is everything is between the sign of Capricorn up to Taurus. So it goes through the 3 winter signs, Capricorn, Aquarius, Pisces, and there are planets in each of those. And then it starts going into the spring signs of Aries and Taurus. And there are also planets in each of those. But the signs that would be the summer signs and the fall signs, there's nothing in there. And you'll also notice how there's a bunch of them all together in the area that would be about 7 o'clock on a clock face, the lower left curve. These are the planets that are in Capricorn. The symbol looks kind of like a VS, kind of curly. Anyway, Pluto has been going through Capricorn for years and years and years, and we've talked about this a lot. And one of the things that it has to do with is sort of a breakdown for a transition. That's Pluto's function. I call him the garbage man. Take out the garbage. And it applies to the Capricorn area, which is governments, systems. And we're seeing in not just our country, but particularly our country, but England as well, that there's big upheaval in how the government is being run. So that's not going to change immediately, but within the maybe decade plus, I don't know, 12 years, 15 years, that Pluto goes through Capricorn, there's certain almost like spike points where things really happen big. And one of them we've just been through when Saturn, the planet in charge of Capricorn, came and joined Pluto. And they were exactly together during those weeks of the Senate trial of Donald John Trump, 45th President of the United States, for his impeachment. So we know that he was not convicted, he was acquitted, but he is forever in history got that sort of scarlet eye letter following him around. And it probably is the first major time in his life that he's ever been called to task or to account for anything that he has done. He's gotten away with, being Teflon Don for a really long time, even with little lawsuits and stuff. And Saturn is the pay the piper planet, and it has to do with laws and the reverse, lawlessness. So that was pretty interesting to me. But on a sort of more general level, not just about Trump, we could also say this was a breakdown in the U.S. government as to how it functions, because one of the branches that was supposed to be a check and balance on the other totally supplicated to it. The Senate just bowed to the White House, and that was that. We also saw how, right very close to this period, January 31st actually, I believe was the date after several postponements, that Brexit really happened. And boy, Brexit almost sounds like Brexit. It kind of has broken the norms that were there for decades with the European Union and with England. So that's pretty interesting. Jupiter, which is a little slower than Saturn. Saturn comes into its own sign for about 2.5 years, and it's almost done. And it only gets together with Pluto just that one time. And I know we've talked about this before, but it bears repeating because of what's going to be coming up on it here soon. Jupiter, which expands everything, is also in Capricorn. It's coming to Pluto 3 times. And those 3 times, the first one's in the spring. It's April 4th. The second is June 30th. The third is November 12th. So from spring into fall, it's a major factor. And Jupiter, being the biggest planet, makes everything bigger. And then, and here's what really concerns us, Mars. Mars is little. Mars is quicker. Mars goes around in 2 years. It will be in Capricorn at that spring equinox at the very degree of Jupiter, and both of them are 1 degree before Pluto and a few degrees before Saturn. But that's how we have that little cluster in Capricorn. Mars is a planet of action, get things done, confront, speak up. It can have a self-concern to it, so we might find that people are very ambitious, which is a Capricorn trait. And Mars is considered well-placed or behaving at its best in Capricorn, where we say it's exalted. That's the astrological term. And that's probably because Mars can be rash, and it usually acts in a very impatient manner and kind of quickly with no plan, seat of the pants. And yet here we have in Capricorn a sign that likes to plan and look at the long range. So while Mars is named for the god of war, and when it's with Jupiter, we could have some big battles. I'm not sure that they're going to be of the weaponry kind. They might be more of the sticklers about laws, things in the courts, things in the legislature, or the parliament in Britain, or the EU parliament. So we'll have to see how that plays out. I am kind of concerned because it's the god of war, and things are always so tenuous, and it can be very volatile, and we have to keep our eye on that. The other thing for our country that's a little bit scary about this is that President Trump has that Saturn of his birth chart in the exact opposite degree of where this Jupiter, Mars, Pluto are. His Saturn's 23 something, and this is 22 and a half, 22 and 3/4, 24 and 3/4. So all clustered around the exact opposition to his Saturn. And it might just give him more of that sort of battling against the norms of our country. He's been unprecedented and unpresidential since he ran. So we'll see what he's going to be up to. Now, we've mentioned before how there's that troublemaker planet out past Pluto named Eris, and it's making the 90 degrees with this cluster. So that's what I think is really difficult, and we're going to have Mars makes its joining with Pluto the 20th of March, just before, nope, that's the day after the spring equinox is early this year. You know why? It's early in our calendar because we stick leap year day in there. So that means that what's happening astrologically shows up kind of like a day earlier on our calendar. So spring equinox the 19th. On the 20th, and you can see on that chart how close Mars, it looks like the man symbol from biology, the circle with the pointed arrow. It's just bumping up against the curvy 4 looking thing, that's Jupiter. So it joins Jupiter on the 20th. On the 21st, it makes that 90 degrees to Eris. And then on the 23rd, it joins Pluto. And finally, on the 31st of March, it joins Saturn. So that first week of spring is going to be like, I oftentimes think of Saturn and Pluto as being kind of like a pressure cooker. And good thing it has like that little valve, but sometimes it has to blow off to let out the steam. So we'll see. I mean, this isn't a steamy sign. Capricorn is much more kind of cool, diabolically almost Machiavellian. The ends justify the means. Now, in weather, and I promised to mention that, didn't I? In weather, when different planets combine, it can have indications for wetness or dryness or this or that. So there's a great set of books on astrometeorology, which is what they call astrology applied to weather, by a Chris Van Brandt, and she talks about 3 planets in particular that are related to drought, and they are Mars, Jupiter, and Pluto, the 3 that we have clustered together right here in this spring equinox chart. So I'm guessing a very dry spring, maybe some heat to it too, because global warming, of course, but Mars is a hot planet. And what we do is we look, remember I told you if we see around the circle where the planets are placed in relation to the directions, which are the 4 kind of, the cross that would cut the circle into quadrants. The bottom part of that means here, in this place, and that's where we look for weather indicators. And I look to see where are those 3 drought planets in that bottom of the chart position. And it turns out it is in America, and it is in Western America, and it is specifically, almost entirely, California. Yep, all California. Pretty much a little band that goes LA straight up through that I-5, San Fernando Valley, where most of the growing of our fruits and vegetables comes from. It doesn't even quite even go all the way west to San Francisco. So it's really, I mean, yes, with a little bit of leeway on either side, it's all of California, but it's really strong on that growing valley. And if they have drought conditions this spring, it's going to affect your supermarket prices, your fruit and vegetable availability, and they feed a lot of our country and even outside of our country. So that's not so swell. Okay, so now we have to talk a little bit more about this spring equinox chart. One of the things I found interesting, Venus is in its sign that it rules, Taurus, and that's a very loyalty-oriented placement for Venus. You know, it's like stick with it, and I'm not giving up no matter what. And this is the love planet, so we're talking about relationships. Then Venus is 2 signs away from Neptune, which is in Pisces. That's the sign that Neptune rules. So they're both in their sign of rulership, very powerful. And Neptune has a real strong fear versus faith component. I always talk about that as the 2-sided coin with Neptune. And when you have fears, you need to turn it over and see what you have need to have more faith in order to allay or calm down your fears. So these two are making a special kind of triangle called a finger of God, pointing to that non-planet I was telling you about that's off by itself, the one that looks like the asterisk over the cross. And that is the asteroid Juno. Juno is named for Jupiter's wife, and this asteroid has a lot to do with marital matters. And it's spending the lion's share of 2020 in Libra, the sign of marriage. And it's going to be backwards or retrograde there for several months, including most of the spring, maybe all of the spring. So what we have here is Venus in a loyalty sign, making sextile with perhaps trust issues from the Neptune and Pisces, making this triangle that means something needs to be negotiated or a compromise needs to be found, because the Juno backwards in Libra could say marital difficulties, or if not difficulties, a backwards planet oftentimes means let's go back and look at things again. Let's get down to the roots of the matter. So I think that this may be a difficult spring in marital relationships. And for people who are considering getting married this spring, I really want you to think twice about that. Because also, a large part of the spring, Venus is going to get into its backwards mode. So it's in Taurus, very nice, from March 4th to April 3rd. But on April 3rd, it goes into Gemini, and it stays there through August 7th. And that's where it goes backwards. And when it goes backwards, it's not in that nice two-sign relationship to Neptune, the trust planet. It's in the three-sign away, 90-degree, cross-purposes, friction degree called square. And it's going to do that 3 times. And those dates are stretching past spring, but the first 2 are in May, May 3rd and May 20th. And then it jumps to July 27th. The third, when there's 3, is usually the denouement. Things are mostly over by then of what it was trying to indicate. And instead, we're sort of picking up the pieces or integrating in the lessons or taking out the garbage from that. I don't know. But this kind of pattern and setup, like I say, is a difficult thing for relationships. And when we add to the fact that Mars is kind of in a pushy position, and you look at that bundle, when these planets are moving clockwise around the circle on a day-to-day basis, or throughout the course of a day, Mars is going to be the first planet to rise, so it kind of has the extra powerful position of leading that little train, or however you want to look at it. So now when Venus goes retrograde in Gemini, that is a sign about communication. And Mercury, the ruler of Gemini, is going to come quickly through Gemini during that time from May 11th to May 28th. And that includes when Venus is making those first 2 squares to Neptune. So talk it out. Not a time to clam up, a time to open up those channels of communication. Now, I told our director in the booth to get another slide ready to show you. And it is a portion, the first half of the year, of the On a Page is what I call it. And this is a free download on the Astrology Booth website from the Study Booth On a Page tab. And why I wanted to point that out to you is if it shows up clearly enough for you to be able to tell. There's a place where the gray bar changes to the black bar. The gray is the time that a planet is going forward through the degrees that it's later going to backtrack through. And then the black is when it's going backwards. And the tricky point is when it looks like it stops, called the station, and it doesn't move at all. And you can see in the early part of May, within a space of 4 days, we have 3 of these stations. So we have Saturn turns retrograde on May 11th, Jupiter on May 13th, and Venus on May 14th. So that's a very tricky part of the month. It's not near a new or full moon, which that's the good news. But again, I would say you don't want to be making maybe major decisions around then, because, a lot of times we're of two minds when we got Gemini going on anyway. Not a great time for a major purchase, something like that. And I really am not happy about it if somebody's planning to get married around then. I usually tell the couples, and they don't always like to hear this, find a good date before then, go to the Justice of the Peace or the City Hall, get legally married, then have your party whenever you've planned it, reenact your vows, but you'll have a better wedding chart. Okay, so what else do we want to talk about here today? So Saturn, we mentioned, is the ruling planet of Capricorn, and it's been there for 2.5 years. And this has been a testing time for laws and structures and boundaries. And this has been almost the entire time of the Trump presidency. That's interesting, because we can all admit he has no respect for law. You don't even have to be anti-Trump to say that. Some people are happy about that. You can tell I'm not. So Saturn is going to go into the next sign, Aquarius, on the 21st of March. That's pretty soon, as spring is just beginning. And Aquarius, even though it's the water bearer, and people might think it's the water element, it's the air element. Air is the element through which sound waves travel. So it's the element that has a lot to do with communication. And also, therefore, relationships, because relationships are largely based on communication. And it has to do with community and village and groups and circles of friends, things like that. Now, I mentioned how long Venus is going to be in Gemini, and that's another air sign. So I said, wow, here's a slow planet making a major change into a new sign. And it doesn't just stay in that sign. It kind of dips its feet in, and it's going to be back, and it's going to come back into Capricorn in the summer on July 1st and stay there until December 17th. So it's not quite done with Capricorn yet, but it's going to give us, through most of the spring, a preview of coming attractions of what's going to be involved when it is in Aquarius. Now, Aquarius, we talk about the age of Aquarius. That's a big, long thing of 2,000 plus years that we're just about grooved into. And that's supposed to be the time of brotherhood and humanitarianism. And Saturn is a planet about the laws and how things are structured. So it's going to be very interesting to see, maybe not in this year's budget, but maybe as we get into 2021, 2022, especially if we have a change in the Congress here or a different president, we're going to see what is the law going to do about the discrepancy between the richest and the poorest, or how we treat the poor in this country. As I'm recording this, a new budget has just been proposed by the Trump administration. It won't pass the House of Representatives, but it cuts way back on not only environmental protection, but all of the social programs. Already food stamps has been cut and stuff. It's not the way to have a village. It takes a village. The village needs to have cooperation between all the people. Anyway, this is why I said spring is in the air, because it's an air sign. So, let's see. I mentioned how Venus is in Taurus for a little while, March 4th to April 3rd. Then it goes into Gemini. Aha, and before Mercury gets into Gemini, it's in Taurus. So they're each in the sign that the other one rules. Mercury in Taurus ruled by Venus. Venus in Gemini ruled by Mercury. This is called a mutual reception. They kind of share energy back and forth. And that is in place from April 27th to May 11th. And just before all of those retrogrades come together for 4 or 5 days. So if you need to do something that is financial decision making, maybe investment related. Late April, early May, probably a better time for that. You know, Pluto is the main planet about markets, commodities, anything that's shared financial matters, banking, insurance, taxes. That one is slowed to a stop and changing direction on April 25th. So you want to stay a little bit away from that. And that's why I said maybe get to the late part of April, around 30th, May 1st, May 2nd. In that time frame is much better for financial matters. And oh good, that's in the growth part of the lunar cycle, which would be between a new moon and a full moon. New moon on 4/22 in Taurus. Oh yeah, I remember that one. And the full moon the 22nd. Well, what do I remember about that one? The other planet that's in a spring sign now in Taurus is Uranus. And Uranus is very volatile. I kind of call it the roller coaster, especially when it applies to financial matters. And Taurus is a money sign. Ah, guess what? Sign of the bull. Bull market. Now that would be interesting. Uranus means unusual things. And it's very close with the sun and moon at that new moon on March 24th. So that month that runs from March 24th to April 22nd, we may find an unusual bull run in the stock market. Now, I'm not a financial astrologer. Don't go bet your farm on what I'm saying here. But we'll just see if that turns out to be true. That's pretty interesting. Okay, what else? Well, when we talk about Venus as values and Taurus as well and Mercury as communication, that mutual reception time will be a very strong time for people to talk about what's most important to them. And that happens a lot when we've got primaries going on, and that's during the primary season. Okay, what else? There are some nice connections between planets at the spring equinox. There's one of those 2 signs away favorable connections between Mercury and Uranus. Mercury rules the mental functioning, and Uranus is even related to like the nerve synapses in the brain, and sometimes I think of Uranus as being like the light bulb going off in your head. So this spring could be a very good time for smart ideas for you or anybody else. Maybe some good inventions will come up, or some nice ideas about what to do on electricity production, because Uranus rules electricity. What else? We have a minor, almost a planet named Chiron. We nickname it the wounded healer, or it helps us see what's weak, what needs to be shored up. And that's with Mercury. That's with the sun at the spring equinox. And that might say sun is leadership. There's something about a wound around leadership that needs to be healed. Well, we'll see what that brings. This takes us down to the end of our time together. It's been fun looking at how spring is in the air, and I hope you have a great spring, and come back and see us again soon on Looking Up.